Welcome to VLGA Connect. My name is Catherine Arndt and I'm the Chief of the VLGA Connect studio. I hope you enjoy today's Connect episode brought to you by the VLGA, the national broadcaster on all things local government.
Hello everyone, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is when you're finding this on YouTube and our podcast. It's governance update time from VLGA Connect with thanks to Hunt and Hunt Lawyers. Stephen Cooper, it's so good to see you. It feels like it's been a long time.
Well, Chris, Eddy, good to see you. And haven't you had a big week?
A huge week, and I think that's why it feels like it's so long, because we've been away to Canberra for the National General Assembly, which we'll talk about. Full on 3 days. We drove up and back. It was a really good experience and a great Congress. I've got to say congratulations to Alga and all involved in putting it on.
Well, Chris, I'm exhausted just looking at your photos on social media. You know, you were snapped with a veritable who's who of local government.
I've got to say, Steve, the love for the governance update and for the local government news roundup was terrific. And really, as I said in one of my posts, quite humbling. A lot of people are listening and watching and enjoying what we're doing, which is really nice to see and know.
Well, I'm sorry for those people, but yes, isn't that? But thank them.
Now, before we get into the news of the week, we need to deal with a little bit of news of the day. As I'm sure you're aware, we can't ignore these special events, obviously, especially when they fall on the day of recording. It is National Take Your Dog to Work Day. Are you aware of that? Where's your dog?
Well, it might be, but no, it's as Boof is 12 and he thinks it's National Just Let Your Dog Have a Rest Day.
Well, just a moment, because I've got one who's having a rest here, but he needs to make an appearance. Just stand by. Just to prove that I did take my dog to work today, this is Boots, and he's sleeping in the corner because it's still early in the day, and he sleeps for about 12 hours, don't you, mate?
Perfect dog. I love a dog like that.
The other one, who wasn't invited into the studio this morning, is actually sitting right outside the door because she's quite annoyed that Boots.
What do they call that, Chris? Is that rejection anxiety?
Yes. My wife just sent that to me and said, it is not National Leave Your Poodle Outside Your Office Door Day. That's a different day.
How mean. How mean are you?
Let's get to the news. Just before we leave Alga, Steve, and National General Assembly, there was the usual motions that were debated, a range of issues, obviously hot topics at the moment around housing and funding models, etc. It was terrific to see the new local government minister, Christy McBain, on a number of occasions during those few days, and I got to meet her personally, which was a thrill and a highlight of the meeting. Stan Grant gave probably one of the highlights, an address on global democracy, and the Ukraine ambassador, I'm not going to try to say his name again, I did practice it for the roundup, that was a really moving moment and led to a motion from the floor to stand in solidarity and support with Ukraine. Just some of the highlights of those few days.
Yeah, a reminder that sometimes the collective actions of councils, Chris, whilst we might not make a huge difference, can be put towards causes that are bigger than, or that sort of fall outside our municipal boundaries.
All right, so we'll look forward to next year, but it's going to be hard to top. Biggest one ever, over 1,000 delegates from what I understand, and just people really wanting that opportunity to get together again, I think.
Well, congratulations to Councillor Linda Scott and Olga for running what was obviously a fabulous conference.
She was terrific, by the way. What a great spokesperson for the sector, and she managed those parts of the Congress exceptionally well. She's in Melbourne today, as we speak, for the MAV State Council, so it'll be good for the Victorian reps to hear from her today as well.
To follow up on any issues, Chris. Let's move on.
Let's move on. Big story this week is the news that the monitor at the City of Yarra, Yehudi Blaisher, has had his term extended for 3 months, which will go through to the end of September now, 23rd, I think, as a result of his 6-month report that has also been released this week and makes for some interesting reading, Steve.
Chris, I thought it was a cracking report and a lot of vignettes through the report around culture, around the impact and capability of the organisation, around the organisation's finances, I was really taken by the fact that Yehudi took the opportunity, even in the description of Yarra as a municipality, to end that with, I'll read this quote, about the community. Among these are a number of highly articulate community groups and individuals with strong connections to mainstream media outlets and active use of social media, which amplify normal differences of views between councillors. Some councillors actively encourage and indeed use these outlets to create a false impression of controversy and indeed crisis in relation to certain matters.
False impressions of controversy and crisis. That is a wow, isn't it?
Yeah, so effectively beating up conflict where it is possible to actually work one's way through to sort of bring the differing views together. And I was taken by,
Steve, is that, do you think, because, I know you're only speculating as am I, because they feel that that is necessary to get the political outcomes they're looking for, or do they just enjoy the sport of it?
Well, it might be that there's a bit of both, Chris. I mean, I think the report certainly talked to the fact that there is an unhealthy dynamic that is based on the political allegiances, and elsewhere in the report talked about the difficulty of putting aside those those political allegiances. But, we're all humans, and isn't it the case that for some people, once you're in a pattern of behaviour, it's easy just to continue with that pattern.
There's quite a few things in this report that make you think. Mr. Blaisher makes a statement about the council being currently financially unsustainable. That's a big statement, isn't it? And largely due to, or partly due to, I should say, some structural budget issues. And he very clearly says there's some serious internal issues that the new CEO is going to need to be addressing, and that's Sue Wilkinson, who starts next week. And just on the CEO note, very pleased to see a really positive comment about Chris Levers as the interim CEO and the leadership that he's provided in what's got to be a really difficult and challenging period.
Oh, absolutely. And congratulations to Chris for that. I think the comments around financial sustainability, some of them were around investment in IT, a failure to raise user charges when the opportunity has arisen. Almost, I think you'd define it, Chris, as kicking the can down the road at times, which has left an over-reliance on government grants, which is sort of, there's a quote from Hemingway around, how do I describe it, around the fact that the descent is slow, is gradual, and then happens really quickly, like the crisis happens quickly. And I think there's a risk for council organisations of not taking those decisions, and the accumulation can be catastrophic. So I think Yehudi's calling that out early in terms of the finances, that there are structural issues that need to be fixed.
Devil's advocate question here. When you read the terms of reference, which I did a refresh of, some of these financial issues, is it drawing a long bow to call them governance practices, or do you think that's a fair interpretation of what he was asked to do in that 6 months?
I think it is not drawing a long bow at all. That if, fundamentally a lot of the difficulties that councils face in terms of just the problems, with the community and running an organisation, are that the council is required to be financially sustainable. That frames all of the decisions in the choices that we make, in the level of rating. No one wants the rates to go up, but from a good governance point of view, often they just have to. That's the way it is to manage a sustainable organisation. So, yeah, I see them as intrinsically linked, Chris, if I can say that.
I did hear someone question that, and truly was a devil's advocate, because I had a feeling that would be your response, Steve. Because my view is the terms of reference were broad enough, and you've got a person of that calibre and experience in place. You wouldn't want it restricting the ability to really nut out some key issues that need to be highlighted, as he has done. Planning's another one, Steve.
Oh, absolutely. Actually, just on finances, quickly, Chris, if there's any doubt, there's a set of financial principles in the Local Government Act that councils need to follow. I think ipso facto, yes. It's a governance issue. The planning team, there was some really interesting comments there. Chris, Yehudi Blaisher talked about the fact that the council planning team, in part because it's a really contested environment, in part because maybe they're under-resourced, but that organisations or teams under pressure tend to look inwardly rather than being sort of outward and courageous. And they pointed to almost a defensive mindset in the planning team that will need to be addressed. Now, we've talked before about the fact that Sue Wilkinson, the incoming CEO, is a highly experienced town planner, and this sort of issue and having sort of courage in this space is part of Sue's bread and butter. So I think, there's a challenge for the organisation to do that well.
Indeed. So I notice Yarra has responded with a holding response, if you like, to say that they're reviewing the report, but making some very positive comments about working with Mr. Blacher in that 3 months ahead and focusing on continuous improvement. So,
yeah, and let's be clear, Chris. If an external entity is invited into an organisation to do a review, they will find issues that need to be addressed. So let's not be kind of overly critical of Yarra, but sort of take the issues as they should be read as matters, to be addressed by the organisation and the new administration.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. And on the financial issue, you could go into any number of councils at the moment and find issues that point to a potential sustainability issue, particularly on the back of a pandemic.
Absolutely.
The way it is at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah.
Obviously, more so for some than others. So we might leave that there. There's a link to the report, which I'll put in the show notes. You can have a read of the Monitor's report. It is worth a read. It's useful, insightful, and there. But for the grace of God, go I, as one would say.
Absolutely, yeah. Good call, Chris.
Now, while we're talking and recording, I've got a stream of announcements coming out from my Twitter feed from the Victorian government about the departing ministers, the worst kept secret of the last 24 hours, that James Merlino, Martin Foley, Lisa Neville, and help me, there's one more.
Martin Pakula?
Yes, Martin Pakula, thank you, are not standing for election. While
Richard Wynne, sorry, Chris, Richard Wynne had previously announced his intention to not stand, I believe.
As had Jill Hennessy, who's obviously not currently in a ministerial portfolio. But yes, we've had the James Merlino, Martin Foley announcements just while we've been speaking. I assume the others will be drip-fed in the next few minutes. So we'll keep an eye on that. There's some big news happening this week, isn't there?
Yeah. And
ministers, of course, that have strong connections and relationships with local government. So local government will be keen to see who will step up in future, depending on the election result, of course.
Yeah, and I know I've met Martin a few times, and really nice man, but active local member for Albert Park. And I recall years ago when Martin took on that role, that was because of a vacancy caused by the loss of John Thwaites. So you sort of wonder at times when these titans, if you like, leave, what will happen? Well, what do they say? The dogs may bark, but the caravan moves on.
Very good. All right. There's submission number 1 for today's episode title. Thank you, Steve. You never let me down. Let's move on to some more localised news. Despy O'Connor at Mornington Peninsula Shires received some media attention this week for announcing that she was not aware that her allowance would continue to accrue while she was on leave for a tilt at federal parliament, ultimately unsuccessful as we know. And now that she's come back and found there's $12,000 owing to her, she has announced that she's going to donate that money to local homelessness and mental health initiatives. Good on her, I say.
Yeah, I'm with the good on her for doing that. That's terrific. And but you've had a bit of interesting comment on the Roundup social media accounts in relation to that, Chris.
I have, and yes, Kat Bennett, who stood down recently at Wodonga, has engaged with the Roundup on LinkedIn in this particular case to say that she supports that stance that Despy O'Connor has taken, but pointed out that in her experience there has been some pressure in the past from some councillors or candidates wanting to donate their allowances, which places pressure on other councillors to do the same, but that's not necessarily fair in all the circumstances.
Yeah, and Chris, the VLGA's stance on this is on the record that we think that councillor allowances should be a reasonable enough amount so that people aren't discouraged from standing. And it's not the affluent, it's those who, might be making an economic call as to whether they should stand. And I think to Kat's point, there is a real risk if people would see this as just another reason why councillors are paid too much and want to kind of beat down the amount of the allowance. The reality is for councillors, they work long hours, they manage multi-million dollar businesses, and the allowances are earned, and we should view them in that way, I think.
Absolutely right. And as Kat says, you wouldn't want public pressure on councillors to feel like they have to donate their allowance. It's designed to be recompense for costs incurred in carrying out the role. We teach them that it's not a salary as such, hence where it's pitched. So to have pressure to then donate that, I think, is unfair. Steve, we touched on last week the news that had gone a bit under the radar of another a federal election candidate that did not get elected, Rob Priestley at Greater Shepparton, had resigned. Turns out, and it had been reported in the local media, I just missed it, that the main reason for Rob standing down is the number of donations that he had received for his federal election campaign placed him in a position where he felt he would have this unmanageable list of conflicts of interests going forward.
Yeah, the price for Rob of running, a financially successful campaign, ultimately his tilt for a federal seat fell just short. But I think good on him for sort of having the foresight to realise that he was going to confront this sort of succession of conflicts of interest as a consequence of those donations. So I think well done to Rob for making that call.
Indeed, and there's a countback, as we reported last week, coming up in early July on that matter. Steve, we've had some news this week of people standing for putting up their hand for preselection for Liberal Party candidacy at the upcoming state election. There's a few councillors on the list.
For the upper house, I've made a little list, Chris, and there may be others. These are just the ones that I was aware of. Goran Keswick and Maura Louise Deeming from Melton, Councillor Trunglu from Brimbank, Councillor Joe McCracken of Colac Otway, Councillor Josh Morris at Ballarat, Paul Pulick, who's a former Kingston councillor and good friend of the VLGA, Councillor Michelle Kleinert at Manningham, are all councillors or a former councillor who have put their hands up. And as I said, there may be others that I didn't pick up in my quick look through.
And a former councillor in Catherine Burnett-Wake, who was on Yarra Rangers and stood down to take up the Eastern Victoria seat, and has the numbers, and we'll put the link to this. There's a tweet with the lists and the numbers. As I understand, with the numbers, the 1, 2s, 3s, are the numbers that the candidates have indicated that they're prepared to take on the ticket, whether they're listed as third, etc. So in the case of where people have said 1, I think that means that they want to have that top spot on the ticket, and if they don't have it, they're going to take their bat and ball and go home. Is that what that means?
I would say so, Chris, noting that, in the upper house, in the way that works, that number 1 for a major party is a guaranteed election unless something catastrophic happens. Number 2, more than likely. Number 3, you would be an outsider. So, and candidates are making their call.
That'll be interesting to see. And what'll be interesting for me, Steve, to see is how many councils want to go a bit beyond what the Act says in terms of the formalised policy around how councillors treat that period, whether they're going to stand down and at what time, when they declare their hand, etc. It's become a bit of a murky space, hasn't it?
Well, yes and no, when we're not helping, Chris. Noting that there is a best practice guideline on the MAV website, which is worth a read, and as you'll recall, comes up with the reasonable position that a councillor should stand down. I think it was at the time where they lodged their nomination, but we've noted over the federal election period and with people, for example, such as Kim O'Keefe, where they've signified an intent to stand, that some councillors are taking the view that they should stand down much earlier, which we support too.
And that's the murkiness I'm talking about. And when you think about Despy O'Connor's lack of awareness, and not at all being critical, understandably did not realise that while on leave the allowance would still accrue. So there's got to be some sort of, I think, case for providing clearer guidance in some way to councillors who are thinking of making that move.
Yeah, and can we not I think we shouldn't overcook the allowance issue, Chris. The reality is the councillor allowance is a sunk cost. If a councillor, for example, is unwell and required to take leave of absence, then it's not, for a month or two, it's not unreasonable that the allowance would continue. So for that very small handful of cases, I'm not sure that any great change is warranted, and I think Despy's handled it quite well.
I think you've just accused me of being a bad cook.
I would never suggest you've overcooked or thrown out babies with bathwater either, Chris. So.
All right. Sumaya from, I've just lost Sumaya's last name.
Lambie of The Age.
Lambie, yeah, of The Age, posted those pre-selection lists. So we'll pop that into the show notes as well. Where do we go next, Steve? The culture review. Yeah, and the insights report that's been out for a few weeks. I was surprised to see this week, finally, can I say, the ABC has picked up on that report and done a couple of reports, and it's flowed over into Talkback Radio too, about some of the findings or the observations of that report. Not a lot about where it goes next. I think that's still the challenge here.
Yes, and we've talked about that. I thought the rather excellent Margaret Paul, when she wasn't jumping into the Yarra River this week, made that report and in fact interviewed our own CEO, Catherine Arndt, also interviewed Councillor Sarah Race from Mornington Peninsula, and referred to some of the issues going on at a number of councils in regard to, I suppose, the dysfunction associated with the arbitration process under the Act. So certainly threw some issues out there for discussion, and that link is on our show notes, presumably, Chris, and worth a watch.
Yes, it is, and it is worth a watch. And as I say, still sort of looking for some clarity on where to next. I know it's a hot topic of conversation. I know the heads of all the peaks are talking about it. So I think watch this space. There's a clear expectation that I'm picking up that the sector is going to have to pick this up and run with it to see where it goes next.
Oh, absolutely, Chris. And I think there is, not unreasonably, a bit of work associated with just developing a roadmap. Because, well, fail to plan to fail. So we just need to get our ducks in a row and make sure the responses are coherent.
Are you saying from a VLGA perspective, watch this space?
I think as far as I can, yes. Okay. Certainly we've spoken with state government this week, with LGV, and there are initiatives occurring, but we just think they should be orderly.
On the subject of LGV, there's been a bit of a change of thinking in the last few weeks, and they've advertised the role of executive director. I think the expectation was that Sarah Harbidge would hold that role until after the election. But for whatever reason, I'm sure good reasons, they have actually gone to market now. So Davidson's managing that process, and it was advertised, I think, last weekend.
It was indeed, Chris. Dust off your resume.
No, the dust can stay on my resume. I would not have time to do this with you every Friday.
Oh, well, in that case, put your resume back.
It's the highlight of my week. No full-time, extremely full-time plus job is worth it.
Oh, absolutely. A very busy job.
Now, public question time and public participation in council meetings is at the centre of a couple of news stories doing the rounds this week. And I know you've spotted one thanks to a friend of the program out of Canada, Steve. Is it Calgary? No, it's not Calgary. Chestermere.
Chestermere in Alberta. And I thought it was terrific. Actually, thank you to Ian McCormick. And we should mention that Ian's new book around leadership and mayors has been released this week. So congratulations to Ian for that. But he alerted us to a story from the Calgary Herald, yes, about the Chestermere Council. And right at the top of the article, they describe the council as beleaguered, Chris.
Oh, gosh. Yes, the beleaguered Chestermere City Council. Why is it beleaguered, he asks.
Well, I get a sense that there is, not unlike a lot of councils, a very active community group who are very watchful over the activities of the council. This is not an unusual topic, the council deciding how to run its meetings, and has amended its sort of governance rules. And in that process, did away with public question time of councillors and officers at the meeting. And we all know, Chris, that when we review governance rules at councils, that question of community involvement is a live issue.
And there's a link right at the top of that story, which I've just noticed and clicked on. And this particular council is currently subject to a provincial investigation that is scrutinising the actions of the sitting city council. So hence the word beleaguered.
That gets you beleaguered. I mean, the sort of jury's out as to the efficacy of a public question time and whether that actually assists in transparency. Certainly, I enjoyed the fact when I was at Port Phillip, as I mentioned last week, that at that council meeting that there was an opportunity for public submissions, and the council willingly sat through about an hour and a quarter of them. And a lot of councils do that as well.
Yes.
So, there's sort of a question with public question time. I can't believe I said that, as to where that sits with the kind of community engagement framework of the council, Chris.
Steve, it's true though, isn't it, that different councils have different approaches to this issue of public participation in council meetings. Some keep it quite tight, some open it up and say, look, we've got nothing to hide, we want to hear from our community, etc. And there's good and selfish reasons for some of the decisions that councils make. The point is that each council makes its own call in its governance rules, particularly in Victoria. And out of Western Australia, there's a similar story this week, in fact last week, at the City of Swan, where they've reviewed their meeting procedures, local law. We'll put a link to this up in the show notes as well. And they've made a decision to streamline meetings and cut the amount of time for not just the public to speak, but also for councillors to speak. And it was quite contentious. There were 11 amendments to this moved by one councillor. 2 were to reduce public deputation time and councillor debate time from 5 to 3 minutes, and others related to public question time, petition submission and councillor question time. And there was another councillor that put another couple of amendments, 3 up, I think, all of which passed with varying levels of support. So a really contentious issue for the City of Swan in this case.
Absolutely, Chris. I kind of don't know how to add to that other than to say, yes, it is. And yeah, show me, as I touched on before, show me a review of the governance rules, and inevitably that's where we start.
All right. I was a bit gobsmacked with this one, Steve. Out of South Australia this week, the city of Onkaparinga. Last week they announced that they were appointing Alastair Dawson as their new CEO. Alastair recently with Central Queensland University. There was then, quite extraordinarily, an uprising from community and I believe some staff, with a public meeting being scheduled to protest the appointment of Mr Dawson. That was headed off by a confidential special meeting of the council at which they emerged to say they'd agreed with Mr Dawson not to proceed. And so therefore he's been appointed and unappointed in the space of a week, all down to his social media activity.
Yeah, I think the social media activity in question, Chris, was that he referred to the Australian of the Year, or former Australian of the Year, Grace Tame, as a spoilt brat for her conduct of side-eyeing the Prime Minister, and said that she was undeserving of the award, and that got a bit of anxiety, I suppose, Chris.
Yeah. So trying to be impartial and play devil's advocate here, is that a fair reaction? Is this an example of cancel culture going too far, or do you think it's an appropriate response to something obviously that was very controversial for quite some time? It still is.
I think Mr Dawson was, I'd have to say, a bit tin-eared. My take on criticism of Grace Tame is I would ask anyone being critical to question themselves as to whether they've spent an equivalent amount of time or more railing against violence against women, where on average we lose one woman a week due to family violence. And if you're spending a whole lot of time talking about family violence and, raising awareness, then maybe you've got a right to be critical of Grace Tame. And I don't think there's too many in that situation, Chris. The end.
Yeah. No, I can't argue with that. The end. Thank you, Steve. Again, I feel like I'm trying to be devil's advocate today, and I'm asking questions that they need to be asked.
And Chris, this whole thing with social media, it's not new. That when we do our social media training, it's almost a window to our souls, and people know that you would expect staff to know that if their private activity on social media reflects poorly on their organisation, they have a problem. And I think especially for someone moving into a CEO role, to be intemperate on social media, that's a huge problem. And obviously the council saw it as an existential threat to the role.
All right. So the upshot of that is they've got an acting CEO who's now going to remain in place until towards the end of the year and possibly beyond, because elections are due. So the council won't restart that recruitment process until around November, which will be post-election. So that's the city of Onkaparinga. Now, a little bit of an update. Olive the poodle has now, I'm reliably informed, gone into a sulk because Boots is here in the office on National Bring Your Dog to Work Day.
Well, I think dogs should be subject of codes of conduct, Chris, and when you're at work, you don't get to go on a sulk. So I'm very concerned about an absence of discipline at your place.
We'll take that under advisement. Let's get on to some CEO news. Great news for Glenn Patterson. We all know and love Glenn. He's been around the sector for a while. One of the innovative thinkers of the sector. He's been reappointed for 5 years at the City of Casey, effective in September. Good on Glenn.
Yeah, a bit of a theme, following on from Mornington Peninsula about reappointments, Chris. So, yeah, congratulations to Glenn. That's terrific news.
It is nice to be having some reappointments on that list that I keep of CEO appointment to watch rather than changes. I think we're up to 34 CEO decisions being made, most of which have been changes in the role in this term of the council. And you can check that list. I know a few CEOs keep an eye on that list. It's on the Local Government News Roundup website. One story we were going to cover last week but ran out of time or forgot, probably the latter. There's been a bit of the typical Herald Sun coverage, which has also then been picked up with the sensational nightly network news coverage of CEO salaries. In this case, Justin Hannay's salary at Melbourne and Martin Cutter's salary at Geelong has got some disproportionate media attention, in my view.
Oh, Chris, this is so tedious. Can I just trot a few things out? Just, again, a reminder, because this is obviously diarised by certain media outlets to run a story on that. Public servants will always be paid more than the elected, so please let's not make that comparison. It is a comparison that is odious. And the other thing is, I think in terms of the Murdoch press, when they start publishing the salaries of their executives, then maybe we'll take them seriously about the salaries of councils, appointed officials, but until that time, I just think it's clickbait.
Yeah, have we fallen for it? Have we? Because we're talking.
I think you and I have.
Shame on us.
Whoops.
Shame on us. So much to get through. I'll just talk this CEO story just for a moment. We mentioned a few weeks ago at Southern Mallee in South Australia, where their legal costs had gone. For a small council, they'd blown out. They were $50,000 over budget, I think, mainly due to council or conduct issues, investigations and legal advice. That council and that CEO, as of this week, have parted ways, a year short of the CEO, Jason Taylor's contract expiring, which was due to happen in July next year.
I think I saw from the article, Chris, that the council had appointed Mr. Taylor for 3 years and then extended for 1 year and then extended for another 1 year. Yes. So there was something sort of in the ether there that maybe we weren't showing a huge level of commitment.
Yeah. It's in the midst of some upheaval because the council last week voted to reprimand one of its councillors because the South Australian Ombudsman had found a number of conflict of interest breaches there. So there's some tumult. What's the correct word? Are both correct?
They both are, and in that environment, they're having to recruit the CEO, and they're presumably having to recruit other staff. And we've talked before, Chris, about how when the council is unable to sort of work its way in a calm manner through those issues, it does become more difficult to sort of put yourself out there as an employer of choice.
It does indeed. All right, we're probably running out of time. I don't want to overstay our welcome, but we've got a few stories to touch quickly on that are timely. The Treaty Authority Bill. Steve, what's the impact of this for councils, do you think?
There will be an impact, and it's been a terrific level of publicity in terms of the passage of that bill through the state parliament, the presentations by the co-chairs of the Assembly, First People's Assembly. My sort of layman's view of what's occurred, Chris, is that in 2018, the State Parliament enacted the Advancing the Treaty Process with Aboriginal Victorians Act of 2018. What this act does is provide the authority and the basis for the establishment of an oversighting treaty authority and other elements associated to that, gives the authority the funding, enables the authority, and I think I've heard the words used by members of the Aboriginal community or leaders in the Aboriginal community of law and law, to be Aboriginal-led, a really positive advancement, Chris.
Yes, couldn't have put that better myself. And a sort of a linked story. At Moreland, as we know, they're undergoing a process for a name change after receiving advice that the name Moreland has some offensive historical connotations, and the council's working with the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung elders on that process. We've got 3 names out for consultation, but there's a petition that's gone to the local government minister calling on him to intervene in that process. They're demanding that the cost be formally budgeted, and the investigation of relationships between councillors and council officers with the group who originally pressed to change the name. I thought that was curious.
I would hope that as part of whether there's a formal reconciliation action plan or RAP in place, or the engagement with traditional owners, that there are strong relationships between councillors, council staff and the traditional owners, strong and appropriate relationships. And I think in terms of, as we move towards treaty, one of the things that's really important, and again, this is my kind of layman's view, Chris, I'm not, I wouldn't put myself out as an expert in this space, but we have had a couple of 100 years of mistrust, and it is absolutely incredibly important that we build trust with our First Nations communities, and that starts with how we engage through those formal processes. So I don't necessarily see strong relationships as a bad thing, as long as we kind of bring that back to the way that the council does business, and the council has resolved to proceed with a name change, and that will take its course. And when we get to the council elections in 2024, the community will make a decision about that. But this treaty process will roll on, and it has, again, local, state, national and international implications for our nation.
260 signatures on that petition, including a councillor. That's interesting. Councillor Oscar Yildiz. Is this a case of a councillor wearing multiple hats or attempting to? Steve, don't want to get you into hot water here.
I don't know. I'll leave that for Councillor Yildiz. I would have to suggest I'd be sort of a bit doubtful that the minister's going to be particularly swayed by a petition with 260 names on it, Chris.
Yeah. All right. Leave that one there. Friend of local government, Jerome Weimar, has been appointed as CEO of the Commonwealth Games Organising Committee. Congratulations to him. Of course, very close and productive working relationship through the pandemic particularly.
Yeah, and an outstanding communicator, as he was when he had a role in Transport, Chris. And so this is the authority that has been established to, basically deliver the Commonwealth Games. We'll be working closely with those councils. So congratulations to Jerome Weimar. I
wanted to run this one by you. In London, and I have featured this one on the roundup, a newly appointed deputy mayor who was subject to a review for attending a prayer meeting during lockdown, apparently breaking lockdown rules, has done a mea culpa and promised to be better and work for the betterment of the community, etc. But the reason there were no sanctions, Steve, is because the code of conduct only applies to councillors when they're acting in an official capacity. And in this case, the councillor wasn't.
This is going to be a recurring theme, Chris. We might keep coming back to this over the next 12 months. You and I have this sort of strong ethical view that you can't take off the councillor hat. And I think it's a reminder for me that sometimes where the law is not necessarily the highest ethical standard, because you would have to imagine that the reputation of the council has been affected by this. So,
Yeah. I thought it was another interesting, we talk about you can't change your hat when you're elected. You're a councillor, You can't choose to be a private citizen when it suits you. here's a case where the rules seem to allow for that.
Yeah, and that seemed interesting because I thought, Chris, that the fact that the councillor said, look, when he arrived, there were 3 people. He should have left when there were 6. He has clearly mea culpa to the extent that he could mea culpa. Like, so it's not on the scale of offences. It's not catastrophic. It wasn't a party. It was at a prayer meeting, but it was still a breach of the rules. As I said, this but wasn't caught up in this case because it wasn't consistent with his role as a councillor.
Yeah, I thought that was the interesting takeaway from this. We would probably take a different view here around a councillor's actions because there seemed to be a councillor when they do virtually anything. Generally
so, Chris. Yes, and back to the point I made before, it's a healthy dynamic for councillors to consider that is so, even if there might be a bit of a Larry loophole available.
Very true. Sort of brings back some of the winky pop elements, doesn't it?
Exactly.
Okay, I think that's all for today, other than to say I know you've rescheduled the highly anticipated Better Disagreements, Better Teams event, which I know a few people were disappointed didn't go ahead due to unforeseen but understandable circumstances, but it's coming up in August.
5th of August, Chris, it's on the website. We've had more registrations during the week, so I hope people are able to attend. And we'll be adding to that that schedule of development opportunities over coming weeks. So keep an eye out.
Steve.
The other thing, Chris, is that we're anticipating also doing an election series. So invitations are going out to ministers and shadows over the coming weeks. So again, keep an eye out for that one.
Oh, good fun. I hope I can be involved in that, Steve.
You never know, Chris. You never know your luck.
Let's see. All right, let's leave it there. Thank you, as always. Have a great week, and we'll catch up with you next Friday for the governance update.
Sweet. Thanks, Chris.
Steve Cooper, Chief of Staff at the VLGA. That is your governance update for, what are we, the 24th of June. Can you believe it? And it's with thanks to our terrific sponsors, Hunt and Hunt Lawyers. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube and on your podcast app, and we'll be back with more VLGA Connect very soon. Bye for now.